To continue with the program, I would now like to call Supriya Manandhar to share your views, your initial thoughts on this book.
Thank you very much, Manashi. I'm just going to take out my phone because, in keeping with the times, my notes are on my phone, so I'm just going to take that out. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this wonderful occasion. I feel like I'm in some very enviable company. We have diplomatic delegates here. We have people who have looked at Nepal-China, Nepal-Tibet relations very closely. We have professors of literature. We have all these experts here, and I'm not going to be speaking from any of those capacities. So where exactly am I going to be speaking from? I would consider myself to be more of someone who is giving a perspective as a Newari youth and as someone who not too long ago began to immerse herself into the realm of Newari activism and getting to know more about Newari political history. So I'll be talking a little bit from there. Of course, I'm not very well acquainted with Nepal Bhasa literature. I've read a few of Chittadhar Hriday's translated poems. So that would be my acquaintanceship with Nepal Bhasa literature. That too in a translated platform. So I guess I will begin with mentioning some of my apprehensions about reading the book. First of all, I'm reading this in English. The English version was translated from the Khas Nepali version, translated by Durga Shrestha, which was of course translated from the original Nepal Bhasa. So despite the fact that I am a Newa, I am reading this book in English, and I'm not able to read the original Nepal Bhasa because although I do understand spoken Nepal Bhasa, I have a lot of difficulty returning it. Newa ba चाहिँ thu khala ta चाहिँ bhacha problem. My vocabulary isn't as strong, so that's like one of the main hurdles that I'm facing, which is very ironic, and I think that's a little bit tragic as well. And I think that it made me reflect about the socio-political reality of Nepal. Like we call ourselves a diverse country, but how much do we acknowledge that diversity? How does the state look at how to promote that diversity? Those are some questions that I thought about as I began reading this book. And of course, I did think about like what would Dharma Ratna Yami, what would he have felt about me being a Newari reading this in English and trying to understand this? But anyway, I thought about that too. I hope he doesn't feel too bad about it, of course. I am, of course, also reading this with the assumption that the metaphors and the general narrative structure in this poem, this epic poem, have been carried over as faithfully as possible. And I also, the other analogy that I look at this is, in the same way that a Lhasa trader would have carried his goods with care, like covered this perilous journey, and then eventually returned home after having been acculturated at all these various stopping points in his journey, I feel like this book has also come to me in a way after covering through this culturally acculturated journey through different people, through different hands, through different languages. And I think that there's also a little bit of a subtle commentary about the state of Newa political awareness and Newa identity to today, somewhere in that analogy. So I was previously not very familiar with the name of Dharma Ratna Yami, and the extent of the information that I had beforehand was that he had written this book when he was in jail. When looking up some information about him, I found out that he had been involved with the democracy movement, and also, more surprisingly, that he had known Ambedkar personally, which I think is quite fascinating. And of course, he spent 18 years behind bars, and for me, as relatively younger person, let's say, that 18 years, that's a little more than half my age. And just thinking about the fact that he composed a work such as this, under those circumstances, is, I think, a feat of human endeavor, which I acknowledge. So I thought about all these ideas when pondering the book, and I thought about, like, what is the message that has eventually come to me through these two filters of two translations, through all these eras. It's been a long time since the original version was published, after all. Overall, let me begin just with a commentary on some of the literary elements of this book. It's a bit of an abrupt romance story. There are some very interesting metaphors in this. A few that I picked out are when describing the condition of Yami, the protagonist. He was, quote unquote, restless as a flag caught in the wind. And I find this fascinating because I think that it's a little bit related to a political angle as well, like waving flags, the visual symbolism of flags. Another one that I caught on to was the blinding darkness that engulfed Yami's heart, brightened by twin moons in succession. So all these interesting metaphors about journeying, about all these visuals that the narrative has created. Another thing I observed was his descriptions of Tibet, of the journey, are quite vivid. He talks about all the goods that are being transported. He describes the picnics, the pouring of the tea, and all these things. But still, there's an element in there that makes me feel that he considered himself very much an outsider. And I'm going to come back to this point in a little bit. The cross-cultural interactions in the book are also fascinating to me. That's all. As someone who has traveled abroad, I'm always interested in how people of different cultures communicate, in what they have to share with each other. In Yami's conversations with the Lama, or how Hisinorbu, Hisila's father, addresses him as Bhazu, which is a very typical Nepal Bhasa term. The inclusion of a few lines of Tibetan lyrics, for example, those were quite noteworthy. And I also find it fascinating that this text feels very much like he was very pent up about a lot of political ideas, and he really wanted to express them. In his conversations with the characters, he talks about, in a very subtle sense, the social inequalities that are prevalent in Nepal. Of course, the idea of courtship through friends, like how Tashi is a middleman in the relationship between Yami and Hisila, is very interesting, and it gives me perspective on how old this text is, considering how social relations are handled today. The other thing that I thought was interesting was throughout this story, this romance, the conflict is that if they were ever to have a children together, Yami and Hisila, then the children would not find acceptance in either country, on either side of the border. But aside from that, I think there's also a subtle unwillingness on the side of either character to let go of their homelands, because there is no mention whatsoever of Hisila moving to Kathmandu with Yami, and neither does Yami ever say anything about leaving all of his homeland behind and then settling finally in Lhasa forever. And I think that this is very interesting, because it shows that despite all his criticisms of his homeland, despite him feeling like an outcast, he still acknowledged that that was where he belonged, and that was where he ultimately returned. And I think that a text such as this is going to be very valuable for people like myself, people of my demographic. I think that I'm not a very representative Newa youth for various circumstances. Everyone is unique, of course, but I am representative in the fact that many people of my generation can't actually speak Nepal Bhasa very fluently. They can't read Nepal Bhasa very well, and I think that texts such as this do a good job of bridging that gap, that generational divide. And I think it's important for youth in the Newa movement, for youth in the Newa community in general, to be aware of who these pioneers were, of how, like, even under circumstances of duress, people created literature. Although this work does not explicitly talk about a lot of political themes, I feel like it invites the reader through these hints dropped in various places to explore this topic further. So it's a kind of gateway book in a way, and I appreciate that. So with that, I'd like to conclude my little speech by saying I hope that we will be able to read more Lhasa literature in a translated format as well as the original, and that more youth will be able to be acquainted with authors such as Dharma Ratna. Thank you.